Hi friends, and welcome to the first episode of Perspectives on Campus. My name is Zamir, and I'm the research intern at OUSA, and I'm also a student at Western. When I first came to Western, I don't think I really understood how transformative an experience it would be for me. Western's really helped me to find my passion, so many opportunities, a community, and so much more. But that's not to say that my experience at Western has been perfect. In fact, there's so much about my campus community that I want to see change and I want to see improved. And I want to pick my words very carefully when I say this, but I don't think I'd be wrong in saying that one of my biggest issues with Western is that it is a hotbed of racism, especially anti-Black racism. And we haven't really seen a coordinated effort to combat this racism up until really recently. And I really attribute this recent push and this recent anti-racism discourse we've been having on our campus to an incident which occurred in a popular English literature course last year. In lecturing about The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in English 2017, the lecturer Andrew Weenus employed the use of the N-word. And in doing so, he really made the classroom really inaccessible to the Black students present. And I want to be clear in saying that this was not the first time that an educator at Western, or across the province for that matter, has been so blatantly racist. But I think what made this incident really different was the response that we saw from the campus community. And I really attribute that to the really courageous Black students in the classroom who were brave and courageous enough to speak up and speak out. And so today I really want to talk about this discourse we've been having on our campus and what we can do to make our campuses less racist spaces, essentially, especially for our Black peers. So I've invited my very good friend Razan Mohamed to come speak with us. She is a fourth year geography student. She is a member of our Social Science Students Council. She is so much, there's so many qualifications. She also was a former president of the Black Student Association at Western. She is one of the few undergraduate students who sat on our university's anti-racism working group. And she's currently doing some research with one of my favorite professors of all time, Dr. Chantal Richmond, at the Indigenous Health Lab at Western. I am so excited for this conversation, and I'm really excited to hear what Razan has to say.
Hi, Razan. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing good.
Thanks for joining us today. I am so excited to have you. I know you bring a lot of unique, fresh, and educated perspectives, and I'm really excited to, start to be sharing them with the OUSA community.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. So this is our first episode, and one thing I really want to stress from the get-go is how unique each racialized student's experience with racism and anti-racism on campus is. I think it's so important to recognize that our experiences as racialized folk are not monolithic, and the way I might experience life on campus as a brown person is going to be really different than if I were a student of another racial background. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the greatest misconception people tend to have about the experiences of Black students in post-secondary education?
For me, I personally think the greatest misconception that people have about Black students is that once we arrive, at post-secondary institutions, and once we're in the ivory tower of academia, as like some like to call it, that we no longer face racism. And that is like not the reality. It's the furthest thing from it, because once we arrive at these post-secondary institutions, we're still facing the same type of racism and the same type of discrimination that we faced since the beginning of our academic careers. Some starting as early as kindergarten have experienced these different types of things. So, whether that be the disproportionate targeting and regulation of Black people, the erasure and disbelief of Black voices, and just the lack of representation in positions of authority from, faculty, from admin, or from any other different types of authority. I think that between that and the microaggressions and the hate crimes, the reality is that once we arrive on the post-secondary campus, we're met with a whole new layer of racism and a whole new layer of things that we have to overcome.
Absolutely. And I think, with that said, although there will be similarities across students of racial groups' experiences, each student's experience with racism is going to be really, really unique. And you are the former president of the Black Student Association at Western, so you've represented a diversity of Black students on our campus. Have you found that the students you represented experience, being Black on campus differently?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Black people are very complex people, and when it comes from an intersectional point of view, whether that be religion or sexuality or any other type of identity, it really impacts how you move through the university landscape. So someone who is Black and queer, like a Black queer male, or a Muslim Black female, means that in the different spaces they walk into and the different spaces they occupy, they're perceived differently. And those different intersectionalities really impact how they move through those spaces and how just people overall view them. And I think that with that means overall Black students are experiencing multiple forms of discrimination, multiple forms of prejudice, and all these things are happening concurrently. And I feel like sometimes on the university campus, people think that you can remove or like pause one of your identities, and that's not really how it works, because you can't walk into a space and be only Muslim or be only one type of identity. Your Blackness is something that you have with you and something that represents you when you walk into a space and when you're occupying a space.
I totally agree with you, and I think oftentimes the various intersecting identity groups that Black students also identify with are upholders of anti-Black racism as well. I think speaking as a member of the Muslim community or as a Southeast Asian community, we often also perpetuate anti-Black racism. And I think we don't need to look further than the pervasiveness of the skin bleaching market, or the ease at which a lot of Brown and Muslim youth will use racial slurs to really understand that. And I don't think we can adequately combat anti-Black racism until we realize the role we play in upholding it.
I think acknowledging that it's something that a lot of different societies believe in, and a lot of different societies have to work towards dismantling, is really important.
And I think one moment that really shed light on the fact that Black students have differing experiences than their other, people of color counterparts is what happened in English 2017 this year. Would you say that you were surprised by the incident?
In all honesty, I was definitely not surprised by the incident, because it's not the first incident that has occurred on Western's campus, and it's not the first incident that people have heard of, whether it be on Western campus or universities across Canada and the US. And it just shows how these incidents have been occurring over multiple years, multiple times, but there hasn't been anything done in the past to address these issues and to combat these issues.
I think what really worked differently in this instance was the fact that our Black peers and the Black students in the room, instead of relying on institutional mechanisms, turned to social media and said, hey, this system isn't listening to our concerns, and we're going to use this alternative approach this time.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think in the past, what's often happened is when students experience racism or other forms of discrimination, they take the administrative route where they go and they share their story and they share their incident. They might fill out a report, but that also means that these incidents aren't being heard and they aren't being acknowledged by the greater Western community. And I think by the student going to social media to share the incident really shed a light to a lot of the students who may believe that racism is not something that Black students have to deal with on campus every day. It really led them to acknowledge that this is an issue on Western campus, like it is an issue on many campuses across Ontario and across Canada. And I think that was really powerful, because having people acknowledge that this is an issue that's being faced by Black students really allowed them to learn that there is a lot of importance when it comes to allyship and advocating and amplifying the voices who are speaking out and making sure that those voices are heard. And even though the student had to endure a lot of negative resistance from the community, I think at the end of the day, having the opportunity to share her or to share their story and to share everything that happened to them on the Western campus to the greater Western community was really powerful.
And I can personally attest to the fact that sometimes our institutional mechanisms don't work. I know just last year I was attending a guest lecture, and it was about the treatment of civilians in conflict. And the guest lecture really wanted to show how civilians are dehumanized in conflict. And so she felt comfortable using 3 racial slurs. And I raised my hand and I said, was it important for you to say those words to impart the knowledge you're teaching? And she was a little bit taken aback. And I was like, listen, I just think unless that word is essential, which I know it's not, maybe you shouldn't be using it in the context of the classroom. It makes this classroom inaccessible. And right when I was leaving the class, another educator went up to the guest lecturer and said, oh, don't worry about his comments. Kids these days are just too woke. So I think sometimes, the system itself doesn't want to do that important anti-racism work. And sometimes we have to give it a little nudge.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree. And I think in that scenario, that's just another example of someone who has taken the time to speak out, but was in reality silenced, and their feelings were made to feel as if they shouldn't be feeling them, which is not true. Because like you're saying, there is no scenario at the end of the day where you need to be using words and language that have been historically used to oppress a certain group or to just negatively affect a certain group. And I know sometimes professors like to say that it's for educational purposes, but like you're saying, there is not really, there's no situation where it's necessary to invoke certain emotions from students, especially when those emotions are connected to trauma and intergenerational trauma, just to get a reaction from students.
I could not have said that better myself. And as a result of the incident we saw in English 2017, you kind of touched upon this as well. We saw a variety of responses from the campus community. And I was particularly upset to see that some of the most vocal Black students who were in that class and spoke up and shared their experience faced a lot of overt cyber forms of racism. There was a lot of hate mail that we saw. There was a lot of name calling and bullying. What can someone like, myself, a non-Black student and an ally, do to support students who are speaking up and facing instances of racism on campus?
Allyship is something that's extremely important. And I think allyship is, a long-term process that involves multiple steps, which depend on the individual and where they are in their allyship journey. I think the first thing that you can do is to take a step to educate yourself. And education can come in many different forms, whether that means you're reading like Black academic work that has been done on the area of anti-racism, or if you're listening to podcasts, if you're watching YouTube videos, all those are different forms of educating yourself. And I think taking the time to do that is really important, because in order to understand how intertwined and how affected Black students and Black people are by racism that is prevalent in our society, you have to understand the history, and you have to understand the many different forms and how it affects us. So taking that step to educate yourself on the history and the work that Black scholars have been doing for decades in this area is really important. And I think that's like the first step towards meaningful activism, is to amplify the Black voices that are speaking out and support the voices. So like you're speaking in the incident with the professor and how people post on social media, making sure to speak out in the comment section, or making sure to speak out if you make your own post, or if you share something on your story, just to make sure that people are listening to what needs to be said and people are hearing it. And it's especially important for allies to do that, because a lot of the time, the people who need to hear the stories that you're sharing and the people who need to be educated are outside of the circles of the typical activist or the person who's being, who the racism is being perpetuated upon. So I think those are just 2 important steps that you should be taking. And lastly, I think you should really take time to self-reflect and look at all the privileges that you have in society, the privileges that have been given to you because of the racism that is systemically and institutionally affecting Black people, and take time to not only use your privilege for good, but also use your reflection time to see how you can dismantle the privilege that you have and contribute to making, a more just society.
In every way, the society we live in has been built on the backs and oppression of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and that's so important to recognize. And I think all your tips on how to be a really good ally are really helpful. And thank you for sharing those.
Thank you.
And I think, okay, so the hate mail and all that was one very negative aspect to the incident, but we also saw one or two silver linings, and it's unfortunate we have to find silver linings in these situations. But in response to the act of hate, more positively, President Shepard instituted the Anti-Racism Working Group. And you were one of the only undergraduate students who had the privilege of, sitting in that group. How did this, working group come into fruition? What was your experience like?
So after the incident occurred and after the student was met with, horrible hate crimes, the university did have a stronger response to what was happening to that student, and overall the institutional and the systemic racism that has occurred on our campus and that has lived on our campus. And I do believe that that incident was the first time the university ever recognized that institutional racism was an issue that was occurring on our campus. So I think having the anti-racism working group, which is comprised of different faculty, students, researchers, and different scholars overall, was a really great opportunity to have all the different perspectives that live and work and participate on our campus, to make sure voices are amplified and to make sure stories were shared and recommendations were created. And it was really important to have that working group, and a really great opportunity to make sure that we're taking a step forward towards making change and not doing what has been done in the past, which is often trying to do stuff behind closed doors and without the participation of the groups that are being affected. And overall, I think the anti-racism working group was a great first step forward, but there is a lot to go on the journey of working towards dismantling systemic and institutional racism.
Absolutely. And the working group just released its recommendations publicly. And so I'm wondering, now that we've had some time to review them, see how the broader campus community interacts with the recommendations, do you think that the anti-racism work conducted by this group will benefit the next cohort of Black students who are coming to Western in the fall?
So I definitely think this is a great step forward towards ensuring that the incoming cohort of students have a more safe, a more inclusive and diverse campus. But we need to ensure that these recommendations are being implemented, and making sure that we have goals and we have metrics to measure our success or even our failure of reaching those goals. Because I think the anti-racism working group was a great starting point for conversation and getting people to understand that this is an issue that has been affecting students of color, specifically Black students and Indigenous students, for so long, and ensuring that these voices are heard in turn turns into something that actually comes to, or that actually enacts change and enacts a better campus community. But even the fact that this conversation has started, I think will help the incoming students, because no longer can someone say, Western, racism doesn't happen at Western, or racism isn't prevalent at Western, because, we have how many page report that dictates, different stories, different survey results, and it's something concrete that people can't refute.
Absolutely. So we've had a working group. BSA has released recommendations as well. Students are speaking up, and it seems like the administration is finally paying attention to this issue. What now?
I think the next step is, in addition to making sure, the 23 or 24 recommendations are enacted and are actually occurring, and the administration is taking the time to make sure that they're seen through, is just continuing the conversation, because having a conversation around racism and what students are enduring on campus and off campus is really important.
Thank you. Yeah. And I know your thesis also this year focuses a lot on how we can do that anti-racism work. What have you been finding?
For my thesis specifically, I'm really researching different spaces that students can take up on campuses in the form of, physical rooms or physical buildings, and how these counter spaces can serve as a safe space for students of color, specifically Black students, and ensuring that these spaces are also a place of learning for, non-Black, non-POC individuals. And I think what I've been finding throughout my research is that often when it comes to Black students of color within an institution, which is, Western, for example, is a predominantly white institution, these students are often policed. So whether it be being asked to be a little bit quieter in the library, or police on campus, it really creates a sense of fear and lack of belonging within those students' population. So I think having a specific space dedicated, which is what I'm researching in my thesis, is a really great opportunity to kind of exemplify for students that they have a safe space, and for other students to understand that they have a space where they can learn and understand different ways that they can individually combat systemic and institutional racism.
Yeah, and I think safe spaces on our campus grounds are so important because oftentimes our BIPOC and especially Black and Indigenous peers don't really have spaces where they totally feel welcome and accepted, even in the broader community. I know in Eternity Martis's column on Vice, London, Ontario was a racist asshole to me. She really talks about how, anti-Black racism that students face is not limited to the campus grounds. The city itself is also a site of a lot of violence, abuse, and harassment.
Yeah, definitely. I think Eternity's work really points towards how important it is to not only work towards dismantling institutional racism within the Western community, but also ensuring that the students who are on our campus and who participate in, whether it be the greater London society or the greater society of the world, are practicing these anti-racism aspects. Because without that, to kind of only target racism within the institution doesn't really make sense, because as a student, I am not spending 24/7 on the university campus. And yes, even though the university cannot control what's happening outside of the university campus, they can impact those who are on the university campus and leaving to be a part of society outside of the university campus.
I know particularly on our campus, we have this huge campaign about, breaking the Western bubble and getting students engaged in the community. But in order for students to feel safe doing that, we need to make sure that the community is also embracing of them.
Yeah, definitely. I think that means working with, whether it be the broader London government or outside of different like that, to ensure that students are protected and feel safe when they're within the London community, whether that be, Richmond Street, or if they're just going back to wherever their student residence is making sure that, they feel safe and they feel like they have allies around them to help them if something does occur. So I think that's really important. And I think overall, it really does point towards the fact that even before students are entering post-secondary institutions, they're already acknowledging that they might have to encounter and they might have to face racism, which is a really troubling fact, because when coming to a new university, students should be worrying about, what courses they're taking, who their professor is. They shouldn't be worrying about what types of racism and what types of forms of racism they'll be enduring on campus and within the London community for 4 years or for however many years they are in London.
Yeah, you definitely should not have to pick your university based on what is the least racist. You should be picking on,
definitely.
What's going to be able to help you excel professionally and so forth. And I think we are doing our Black students such a disadvantage by not creating safe spaces for them.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Razan. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I think I learned so much from you. And I was just wondering if you have any concluding thoughts for our friends who are watching.
I think overall, just make sure that, things like this ensure that the conversation keeps going. So I think things like this are really amazing, because the most important part when working towards dismantling systemic and institutional racism is ensuring that we have the conversation always going in the background, because no matter how many different recommendations we enact and how many different things we do, we have to always make sure that on the individual level, we're speaking about this, because if we're not speaking about it, that means we're ignoring it and we're perpetuating everything that's happening. So I think something like this is really great.
Absolutely. And so thank you for joining us. We will be sure to keep the conversation rolling. And to everyone watching, thank you for watching.